Good afternoon, everyone. Welcome to the UWI St. Augustine Faculty of Law Research Skills series. For today's installation, we have a very interesting topic, one that I think we can all relate to because it's public health post-pandemic. And today we have Dr. Kayum Ahmed from Columbia University, who is a subject matter expert in this area. So we're very lucky to have him here today. As you know, for the Research Skills series during this lunchtime learning session, we allow the speakers to introduce themselves. I'm going to hand it right over to Dr. Ahmed to begin today's session.
Excellent. Emma, thank you so much for this wonderful opportunity to engage with your community around the very important question of public health in the post-pandemic world that we are currently living in, of course, anticipating also future pandemics. And what I'm going to do is to share my screen. I've got a couple of slides that I want to share with you. Let's see whether that works. Can you all see that okay?
Yes, we are seeing.
Yeah, perfect. So let me do that. By way of background, I'm a South African human rights activist and scholar, and I've been teaching at the School of Public Health in New York at Columbia University for the past 3 years. I teach a course on health and human rights advocacy, and I've increasingly become very interested in indigenous knowledge systems or indigenous epistemologies and the way in which that has reshaped the public health landscape. And particularly since I moved to New York, to Manhattan, which, as you may know, is actually an indigenous Lenape word, Manahata. I've been working increasingly with Lenape indigenous scholars to rethink our very definition of public health, particularly at an institution like Columbia University, which is a colonial institution in many respects. Its architecture is rooted in a system of coloniality. It is an overwhelmingly white liberal American institution and has failed to fully acknowledge its location on stolen indigenous land, which occurred through an ongoing genocide against indigenous peoples. And so even methodologically speaking, as we come to this topic, one of the motivating factors for me thinking through these questions around what a post-pandemic public health space would look like is in some ways informed by my very geography, my location, my own upbringing, and spending the first 18 years of my life living under a system of apartheid and racial segregation in South Africa. And so my own personal experience clearly shaped the way in which I engage questions of public health. In addition to teaching at Columbia University, I have a visiting scientist affiliation at Harvard University's FXB Center for Health and Human Rights. And I also serve as an advisor to the New York City Pandemic Response Institute. I'm helping the city design interventions as it anticipates future pandemics, drawing very strongly on a racial justice and social determinants of health lens. So I'm actively engaged in some of these conversations, both within academia and also outside. And I hope to bring some of these questions to you. And I honestly am here not to simply transmit knowledge and expertise to you, but really to engage you in a conversation around some questions that I'm struggling with and grappling with, and I haven't quite figured out. So this is not a presentation of a fully thought through and well-baked idea. It is really a space I'm hoping for some genuine conversation, reflection on what I've been able to do so far, and perhaps throwing on your expertise and knowledge to help think through what some next steps might be like. So to start off with a bit of background and context, the post-pandemic space has in some ways been informed by what can only be described as the catastrophic failures of the global health architecture, primarily during the pandemic. We saw, for instance, how access to vaccines during the pandemic was often determined by how wealthy a country was rather than the needs of certain countries. And so global North countries, Europe and the United States at the time, had a far larger supply of COVID-19 vaccines than the rest of the world. And I recall very distinctly, because I live in New York, I received notification that I could already receive a booster shot, which would be my third shot. And that same week, two of my uncles living in South Africa in their 60s and 70s died because of COVID, not having received a single dose of the vaccine. And so again, geography plays a particularly important role in how public health resources are shared and, of course, not shared. And I'm, again, acutely aware of being an African living in the United States, what that difference in geography does in terms of access to resources. And so a call for a new global health order, which was in fact led by the Africa Centers for Disease Control, the former executive director, Nkenga Song, pushed us to think about what the evolution of public health might look like in this post-pandemic world. These calls, of course, for a new global health order have been fueled by a number of social movements. The decolonizing global health movement, which started around 2016, preceding the pandemic, the vaccine justice movement, which built on the HIV and AIDS movement of the 1990s and early 2000s, pushing for equitable access, global equitable access to COVID-19 vaccines. The Black Lives Matter movement, which of course pre-exists the pandemic, but amplified following the murder of George Floyd, which happened during the pandemic. And then, of course, the climate justice movements, which have recognized the intersection between the climate crisis and the impact this has had on human health. And so these movements collectively, I think, have fueled very important questions about how we engage on questions of public health in this post-pandemic world. And these questions have led me to think through what should the future of public health look like? And as a human rights scholar and activist, what do we mean when we talk about the human right to health? And what kind of research skills are required to navigate the evolution of our understanding of health? So focusing specifically on the right to health, there are a couple of questions that I want to pose for discussion and debate. The first is, how has the right to health evolved over the past 75 years since the adoption of the Universal Declaration of Human Rights in 1948? We've seen how in 1948, the emphasis was very much on physical health. In the 1970s, when the International Covenant on Economic, Social, and Cultural Rights was passed, we see the evolution of the right to health moving from not only physical health, but also to psychosocial health, mental health in particular. And then we see a further evolution in 2000 when General Comment 14 is adopted by the UN, talking about the social determinants of health, recognizing that access to medicines, access to hospitals is only one small component of the right to health, that we also need to ensure people have access to clean water, food, housing, education in order to secure their right and realization to the right to health. And so we've been thinking about this evolution of the right to health over the past 75 years and what we would need to do to anticipate some of the evolutionary directions and trajectories that are emerging in this space. A second question that I've been confronted with is who and what constitutes the human in human rights? And how might this anthropocentric or human-focused approach to rights discourses shift because of the climate crisis? This question of the human in human rights started when scholars such as Mutua made the argument that the human rights framework is of in itself a predominantly Euro-American or Western framework that imposes a particular worldview on us. It is centered on individual rights rather than notions of collectivity, which are often dominant in Global South discourses and frameworks. It tends to adopt a fairly liberal discourse, and I should add a sort of white liberal discourse when it comes to human rights. And it very much is embedded within the system of capitalism, which is in some ways antithetical to the very idea of human rights. And so we've been asking this question about who are the humans in human rights, and particularly during the pandemic, when the vaccine in some ways became an instrument of determining who should live and who will die, as an instrument for determining who is human enough to receive the vaccine and who isn't. It has forced us as human rights scholars to begin to rethink this notion of human. And then on top of that, we have this emerging ongoing climate crisis. And we recognize that we cannot separate the health of human beings from the health of the planet. And so this intersection between human and non-human nature, and this binary that has been established, is something, again, that is being challenged by in the sort of post-pandemic space. And so the question again is, what methodological approaches can we apply to support this evolution of the right to health over the past 75 years and into the future, which includes reimagining the human, non-human binary. And so for this presentation, I want to focus on some elements of these questions. We won't be able to get through all of them, but invite you to also contribute to answering or perhaps helping to think through how to answer these questions. And so I want to present some work that I've been doing with the Lenape indigenous community here in Manhattan. And starting off with a poem by Natalie Diaz from her series of poems called Post-Colonial Love Poem. She has this wonderful poem, which whenever I start my class on health and human rights advocacy, we start outside of the classroom in front of the entrance to the Mailman School of Public Health at Columbia at the medical campus. And I read out this poem. Manhattan is a Lenape word. Even a watch must be wound. How can a century or heart turn if nobody asks, where have all the natives gone? If you are where you are, then where are those who are not here? Not here. Which is why in the city, I have many lovers. All my loves are reparations loves. These are, extracts from a much longer, very powerful poem that in some ways centers the kind of research that I've been engaging with in the last couple of years, and recognizing that in an Ivy League institution like Columbia University, with all of its resources, and the Mailman School of Public Health, which has been around for the past 100 years, there isn't a single faculty member who is indigenous. There are a handful of students, and I can count on one hand, perhaps, how many Native American students are actually in classrooms across the School of Public Health. And so this question becomes quite pertinent. How can a century or a heart turn if nobody asks, where have all the natives gone? And so I have deliberately, as a foreigner in this country, begun to ask these questions of my colleagues, of the institution, and I've been working very deliberately with indigenous Lenape scholars and activists to begin to address the fundamental epistemic gaps in our curriculum, in the way in which we teach. And at the moment, again, after 100 years of the Mailman School of Public Health, I now co-teach a course with Lenape elders and scholars on indigenous knowledge systems and public health, which is currently ongoing. But it again points to how, in some ways, the research is informed not so much by what we see, but the erasure and the absence of what should be there, but is completely missing, right? And so I take my class, we start off with this poem, and I take my class on a walking tour of the Mailman School of Public Health and the medical school campus, pointing out to the fact that the name Mailman derives from a wealthy white man with no discernible connection to public health. He simply donated money to Columbia. And then we walk across to the library, named after another wealthy white man who was the CEO of an oil company. And then we walk over to the building where I teach the class, which is named after a very wealthy white man who's a former farmer CEO. And then, ironically, we walk into the classroom where I teach this class, and it's called the Bank of America classroom. So the system of capitalism and colonialism is so deeply infused and embedded in the architecture of the institutions we teach in that my methodology in thinking through these questions is in some ways to disrupt the coloniality of the education system that is dominant and hegemonic in the United States, and therefore challenge the not only what we learn, but how we learn about these issues. And so drawing on this kind of framework in thinking through public health in a post-COVID world, I've been working, as I said, with indigenous scholars of Lenape descent to try and introduce terminology that draws on indigenous ideas and indigenous knowledge systems, such as Welam al-Sawakan, which is this notion of good health in Lenape knowledge systems. And we make the argument that human rights have historically advanced this very human-centered, anthropocentric worldview that focuses on the right to health of human beings, often disconnected from non-human nature, from trees, from animals, from rivers and forests. But for the Lenape, the border between the body and the earth, between human and non-human, is far more flexible and fluid than Western knowledge systems. So Lenape elders have said to me that when they bury their dead, the burials are often, people are completely naked, put into a fetal position, buried into the earth. Very different from the way in which we tend to bury our dead here in the United States and in Europe, in a coffin, wearing a suit, completely separated from the earth. And so, it just gives you a sense of the fundamental difference within which we approach this relationship between the body and the earth. And of course, how that affects our thinking and understanding of bodily health in relation to the earth. And so the question we pose is, what would the right to health actually look like if we delink from this fairly Euro-American conceptualization of human, non-human, and instead drew on indigenous Lenape knowledge systems? And so we also explore some of the precedents that have emerged in other jurisdictions outside of the United States. And the example of the Wanganui River in New Zealand is a particularly interesting one, where the status of legal personhood was given to the river in 2017 through legislation that recognizes the health and well-being of the river and the communities that sustain it. The thinking by the New Zealand Maori community is that they don't only live alongside this river, but the river gets absorbed into the body when they consume water and gets excreted back into the river from the body. And so there is no barrier in some ways between the river and the human body. And so the health and well-being of the river has a direct influence on the health and well-being of the body. And I think this in some ways symbolizes what a relationship between human and non-human health could potentially look like. The UN General Assembly also very recently in 2022 passed a resolution recognizing the right to a clean, healthy, and sustainable environment as a human right. But you'll notice this only happens in 2022, 73 years after the adoption of the Universal Declaration of Human Rights. And it's only a resolution. It still has to be negotiated and engaged and incorporated into the right to health framework and the human rights framework. And so you'll notice that indigenous communities often are, decades or even centuries ahead of where we are as human rights scholars. But increasingly, there's recognition, even at the UN, that we need to think more broadly about how we engage the environment. And then, of course, one of the challenges with the right to health and the way in which it's formulated in the Universal Declaration, but particularly in the International Covenant on Economic, Social, and Cultural Rights, is that the right to health must be realized progressively over time, which means that unlike the right to vote or the right to free speech or the right to a fair trial, which must be immediately realized, the right to health alongside other economic and social rights such as the right to water, food, housing, education, are seen as progressively realizable. They are realized not immediately, but over time, based on the available resources of the country, of the member state who has signed and ratified the international instrument. But this notion of resources and time may not always be transferable to nature, because as Lenape scholars have said to me, even their conception of time, which is more circular rather than linear, is fundamentally different from the way in which Euro-American conceptions of time are conceived. And so when we engage, for instance, with indigenous Aboriginal communities in Australia, they say to us that the conception of time, which is also a circular conception, means that events that may have happened years ago but had a profound impact on the person or the community are seen as closer in time than something that may have happened just yesterday. So the impact, for instance, of colonization on Aboriginal peoples in Australia, even though this may have happened hundreds of years ago, it is far closer to them in their conception of time than, something that may have happened just yesterday. And so even the notion of time and of resources are fundamentally challenged through indigenous knowledge systems. Resources, for instance, the way in which we think about resources is often centered around capitalist notions of property ownership. We own the land. This is our land. These are our borders. But again, for the Lenape, land is not something that is necessarily ownable. It's like sunlight. You can't quite own these things. You live in conjunction with the land, alongside the land. And so you can't own this thing, because if you can own the land, then you can also own human beings. And because these two frameworks are interchangeable, it becomes an impossibility. So even as the Dutch claim that the Lenape, the indigenous Lenape, sold them Manhattan, the island of Manhattan, for a few beads and trinkets, this is completely nonsensical, because land cannot be sold. And so even the question of resources and therefore time are fundamentally charged ideas that make no sense when we apply this notion of progressive realization, which draws very much on the human rights framework. The Lenape have also introduced this notion of Lankun Tawakkan, or the Lenape way of life. They argue that the earth is in us when we are alive, and we are in the earth when we die. In every sense, we are the earth. So again, this important notion of regeneration is embedded in this notion of Lankun Tawakkan and Welamal Sawakkan. Regeneration, and I'll quickly go through the remaining slides because I really want to open some space for conversation. Regeneration requires this delinking from this human idea embedded in human rights. And it also requires us to think about health as not only a mechanism for protecting the current generation of rights holders, but also thinking about future generations. Because again, in indigenous knowledge systems, communities are not only made up of those who are living, but also of those the ancestors who have passed on before us. But we also have to prepare for future generations. So again, the conception of time is fundamentally different in indigenous knowledge systems compared to Western knowledge systems. And so in rethinking the notion of the right to health, we can't only think about the right to health of our current communities, but also future communities. And then, of course, very importantly, we need to balance the biomedical model of health, which is very much steeped in sort of a farmer model of health, with traditional knowledge systems that advance this notion of good health, or welamal sawakan. So I want to share this bit of research with you, and then quickly turn to a case study that I want to engage you on, and again, work that I'm doing very closely with the community in Guam on indigenous knowledge systems. So drawing on the work that I've done with the Lenape communities here in Manhattan, trying to apply some of these ideas to indigenous communities that I'm working with in Guam, and then would love to get your thoughts. And there's some questions at the end of this case study. So this is a picture of Auntie Frances, who is an indigenous Chamorro medicine woman. And she's in the limestone forest when I took this picture. collecting medicinal plants. Auntie Frances lives on this island called Guam in the Pacific, which is a colony of the United States. The US military currently occupies about 32% of the island and plans to expand its presence by relocating 4,500 Marines from Okinawa in Japan to the island. And they're also building a $1.2 billion missile defense system. The military expansion threatens indigenous Chamorro medicine women who are restricted from collecting medicinal plants on the military-occupied land. The military, on the other hand, believes that Guam is a strategic location because of its proximity to China and North Korea, and so is building all of these weapons defense systems and missile defense systems in anticipation of some perceived military threat. And so I've been working with indigenous women, Chamorro women who are medicine women, as well as their apprentices. And so I want you to imagine for a moment that these Chamorro medicine women have invited you to help them think through the right to health implications that they are currently struggling with, how to balance their access to indigenous medicine with the US military expansion that's currently taking place on the island. And during preliminary discussions with the medicine women and their apprentices, you discover two particular issues that emerge. The first is that the medicine women consider the limestone forest a living entity and believe that the forest has rights independently from human rights. Second, the medicine women who are in their 80s are not ideologically opposed to the expansion of the military base as long as they can access their medicinal plants. The apprentices in their 20s, on the other hand, are deeply opposed to what they refer to as the settler colonial expansion of the US military, even if they have access to medicinal plants. And part of the reason for this generational divide is that during World War II, the island was occupied for a few years by the Japanese, who tortured and killed off a number of indigenous Chamorro people. And when the US reoccupied the island at the end of World War II, they were seen as liberators of the island from the Japanese occupation. And so some of the older women on the island remember this. And so they continue to see the US military presence as a source of protection. Many Chamorro people are also enlisted in the army, but of course have no right to vote for their commander-in-chief. And so younger people who are not necessarily caught up in this history are deeply opposed to the US military expansion and to the US military presence more generally. And they've started something called the Decolonization Commission, which is attempting to decolonize from the United States. So this is a little bit of the background for this case study. And so the questions I want to pose to you is, and let me just move this. How would you build a legal argument that supports the right to health of Chamorro medicine women, as well as the right to health of the limestone forest? So what would that actually look like? And how would you balance these two legal arguments? The second question is, which methodological approaches would you use to document the right to health violations? Third, what are the potential remedies and solutions that you could litigate on or advocate for? And then finally, how would you ensure that indigenous Chamorro epistemologies, knowledge systems are not displaced or replaced by the sort of Euro-American human rights framework? So these are the questions that I wanted to share with you and open up for conversation and discussion. I'm going to stop sharing and then perhaps paste these questions in the chat so that you are still able to see them. But very happy to take some comments, questions, thoughts on these questions, but also, more broadly on anything else that I may have said. Anyone wants to jump in?
So thank you very much for that, Kayum. That was very interesting. So anyone who wants to contribute, you can feel free to raise your hand and unmute yourself because I have allowed that setting. If you want to participate in the chat, I'll also be monitoring that. And I see that Kayum has posted the questions in the chat. So in terms of the first question, while people are thinking, based on well, your presentation first of all is very interesting, Kayum. I must say there's a lot of things I had not contemplated there in terms of the surroundings that we are in, the history of the place, how we conceive time. I mean, there's a lot for me to think about. But in the first question with the legal argument that supports the right of health to Chamorro medicine woman as well as the right to health of the limestone forest, I would say that based on my understanding of the connection with nature and health, that this would have to be an interconnected argument in that the health of the forest is integral to the right to health of the medicine woman, because if they need to collect these medicinal plants, well, then you can't disturb the environment which houses the plants, because that is very integral to their right to health. And their approach to health is going to be different from a Western approach, which uses more factory manufactured pharmaceuticals and whatnot. So I don't think that their right to health can be recognized without also recognizing the right to health of the limestone forest, just like that example you gave us from New Zealand, where the river is so intimately connected. I also really appreciated this perspective that you gave us, because so many health issues now can be attributed to the environment we are in, increase in pollution because of industrialization, increase in desertification, rising sea levels, all these things are affecting our health. Here in Trinidad, we get a lot of Sahara dust. A lot of people have respiratory illness and serious conditions as a result. So I have students who have sinus infections because of the Sahara dust. And of course, that wouldn't have been a foreseen consequence, but none of these consequences are really foreseen until it's a little too late. But in this situation, it's like we have enough knowledge to realize that if we do this military expansion, there's a good chance that the forest is going to be encroached on and the environment is going to change. I would say those would be very integral. But I do want to involve other people, so do feel free, anyone who has some thoughts to contribute. Don't feel shy because, as Kayum indicated, this is all work in progress. So your
Yes.
thoughts are always helpful to researchers in terms of your takes on this. Or if anybody has any comments about what we've learned, because I think we have learned quite a few things, particularly relevant for us in the Caribbean region as well in this post-colonial setting.
Absolutely. And just want to reinforce what Emma said, that I honestly don't have all of the answers to these questions either. I've been thinking a little bit about them, but would really welcome your thoughts and reflections. And already, Emma, what you said in terms of that first question is particularly helpful. Of course, I've been pushed even further by these indigenous scholars who say, well, if you are suggesting that the right to health of the limestone forest is intertwined with the right to health of us as human beings, you are still in some ways applying an anthropocentric framework, because you are referring to the rights of the forest in relation to us as human beings. They're arguing that we should make the argument for a separate set of rights for the forest, almost independent of humans. But I think we may be decades away of getting to that point, but nevertheless, I think it's an important reflection. So really happy to hear from folks. Any comments, questions, ideas, words of wisdom would be profoundly appreciated.
When did you conduct the research, Kayum? I assume did you go to Guam and do these interviews?
Yes, this happened nearly a year ago when I was there and worked very closely with the Chamorro community themselves, who had invited me to come and conduct the investigation.
Okay, so the
Um,
community was encouraging the investigation then. That's very positive.
Absolutely. And so, in fact, that second question around the methodological approaches, I think what I wanted to ensure was very much a community-based participatory research methods, which I know is not often used in legal research, which, tends to focus on judicial precedent and jurisprudence and so on. But again, I'm attempting to approach even some of these legal questions with more of an interdisciplinary way of thinking about the world, and recognizing that in order to do so, we have to employ a variety of research methods to be able to make sense of the complexities that we see unfolding. Yeah.
Well, I think that makes a lot of sense because if we look at just the law in a vacuum, we're not really going to understand the full impact that it's having and the different perspectives of these communities. So you can't really stick to just the legal approaches, many of which are fairly limited when it comes to this real life type of impact. But I guess also a lot of these have been informed by Western approaches to research that have never had really the agenda until very recently to look at these types of issues. So
Indeed,
interesting. Did
indeed.
you find that there was any hesitancy when you were conducting these interviews and maybe some topics were particularly sensitive, although
Mhm.
necessary to cover?
Oh, definitely. So I also met with the US military when I was there, and sat across the table from 18 military officials, asking them questions that were put to me by the activists I'd been engaging with. And one of the first questions I asked to the admiral who runs the US Navy in that region was how he would respond to the assertion that the US military is essentially a settler colonial entity. And of course, the commander very much refuted the idea that they were colonizers, even though the UN recognizes Guam as a colony, and argued very interestingly that they were there to help protect the region, that they were there to as stewards of the environment. They've spent more money than anyone else on restoring the indigenous environment on the island. And of course, it's a narrative that the US military has created, which is completely devoid of reality because the threats to the island are only threats to the island because of the US military presence there. And so, China has created this bomb called the Guam killer bomb because of the US military presence on the island. And so, to justify their presence there and the expansion of the military base made no sense. And the second issue is this narrative that they try to spin about being stewards of the land. When I visited there, it was very clear that they had completely destroyed several thousand acres of forest in order to build a new base, ironically named after an indigenous Chamorro soldier. And when I asked them about the paradoxes of naming a base after an indigenous Chamorro person, who, by the way, later on in his life argued that the US treated him like a second-class citizen, it became quite apparent that the people who I was in the room with, the military folks I was in the room with, initially agreed with the idea that indigenous folks were treated as second-class citizens because they had no right to vote. But then I think quickly realized that they had said something they probably shouldn't have, um, and quickly argued that the relationship between the Chamorro folks and the military was a lot more complex. Is because, as I mentioned, the military provides an important source of income for people on the island. If you join the military, you live on base, your fuel is cheaper, your food is cheaper, you have a secure income. Whereas if you So it's fascinating to see these dimensions play out in the research, which of course also comes up as you're thinking about methodologies and approaches and how to engage these questions.
Well, I must say, Kayam, I think you're very brave to sit down with members of the US military in that number as well and ask them questions that would be fairly contrary to some of the things that they are advancing. So I would say very good job in that regard. I also think whenever I hear the US military, I always recall visiting the US and realizing that what you see on the media and stuff about this love for the military is actually very real. It's not really overemphasized because I was with some friends who had a partner who was serving in the military, and everywhere we went where this was realized in conversation, it was as though a real hero had walked in. And that's a whole complex conversation in itself, but there's a whole ideology behind the US military that really everything is meant to be wonderful and to serve the country and freedom. And as you said, well, they're protecting Guam, but it's a very circular argument because they only need to protect something that they are attracting a threat to. But then, as you mentioned, it's an interesting perspective, well, with the medicine women who are older, who think, okay, well, they were actually freed from Japanese oppression by the American military, so it's not such a bad thing. Whereas the younger people who don't have that experience think, no, this is just further settler colonialism. So that is such a complex situation to even think about. I see Malak has her hand up. Malak, would you like to contribute?
Yeah, I'm sorry I joined late, but I learned about the Guam case study, and I appreciate the conversation being had here, because I'm Palestinian, so I understand the indigenous struggles as well. I'm from Chicago too, but I think listening to the case study, I agree with what was said about, you know, the interconnectedness of like the health of the forest and the access to medicine, which is like leads to, you know, the health of the people. So if the militarization, if the military continues to expand, then of course it's going to have direct effects on like the population's health. But it also reminded me of different things that we see all over the world within the US as well, like right now in Atlanta with Cop City and how they're trying to expand the military into the forest, and how that directly affects Black and Indigenous folks. And, you know, we see it in everywhere in Palestine as well. And these like Cop cities continue this pattern of colonization and occupation of Indigenous land. And it just ends up creating more harm to the land, and the people with the hyper militarized force, even though they make it seem, you know, they have like the savior complex of, oh, like, well, this land would not have anything without us and we're here, we're saving it. But in reality, it's really just to push their own agenda and help them with their goals, in many ways. And honestly, I wish I had some kind of solution or something to pose, but I just wanted to share my comments and my agreements with what was already been said.
Thank you, Malak. I really appreciate your comments. I was actually in Palestine last year. I was teaching at Birzeit University as part of the work I do with Harvard's FXB Center for Health and Human Rights. And, you know, completely agree that there's some interesting parallels and comparisons between US settler colonialism and Israeli settler colonialism in relation to Palestine and the struggle for liberation among Palestinians. And I think the framework offers a helpful way of analyzing the occupation of land and the destruction of the environment and the consequences that has on the realization of the right to health. And so I see those parallels very clearly, even in your comments and reflections and in my own work and experience. So I think there's something particularly unnerving and unsettling about the colonial approach to occupation and what that does to a society and to a people. And so glad that you raised this, because it's not only unique, as I've said, to the United States. All of us in the global South have experienced some form of settler colonialism, or the continuation of colonialism through coloniality. And I think that it's important to not lose sight of that as we connect the dots between these different struggles of indigenous folks and people in the global South. So thanks for raising that.
Yeah, I completely agree with that. And one other thing I wanted to add along with that, and like the way that like Israel's military and America's military are so like deeply intertwined with one another, it's just kind of the way that like, yeah, it does have those severe effects in ways that we don't even notice at first, like in regards to surveillance and having that many people like joining the military and being a part of it, because then that surveillance does go a step further because it causes like internal policing within communities. And then we even can observe that with Muslims within America and the way that like FBI's goals to like deeply surveil highly like Muslim communities or communities that have like larger Muslim populations, and the way that affects the way communities organize or communities interact with one another because of like this level of surveillance. So it's just like the domino effect of like terrible consequences of militarization.
Yeah, totally agree with you. And I think Emma's examples earlier on of the glorification of the military is yeah, another important component. It feeds into the sort of culture of militarization. I completely agree. Yeah.
So Kayum, I have one final comment. So my background is intellectual property, and I was thinking of the medicines, the approach to medicines, and traditional knowledge and intellectual property is always something it's been a discussion for many years now as to how do you protect traditional knowledge? Because again, we're all approaching this from a fairly Western framework where intellectual property is about ownership. But traditional knowledge is usually owned by a community, and there's no real concept of ownership in that sense. I'm using the word ownership because I don't really have a way to explain it, but it's more of a shared type of knowledge. And of course, the issue is we don't actually want people coming in and being able to commercialize this traditional knowledge without some type of compensation being appropriately paid, or sometimes there just is no desire to commercialize it altogether because it's contrary to the value system. So I feel like this is so relevant here to this right to health and traditional medicines, because it's a problem even from the intellectual property sphere. So how do you treat these things? How do you make sure you have some type of equitable approach? But again, even then, while there has been work in the area trying to make a framework from an indigenous perspective, there are so many indigenous communities that you can't say this is now the framework, because that would be exclusionary to the variety of communities we have. So it's always been this kind of tricky approaches. How do we strike the balance between protecting what the community wants protected while recognizing at the same time that if you start saying, well, this is owned by a community, then you're actually eroding the entire concept of how this works, but you're saying this so that you can stop unfair advantage from being taken. So all these thoughts are just swirling in my head. I am aware of the time, so we do have to end now, but this was very interesting. Thank you so much. So I see Vivek, I'm going to read out his comment before we close. Vivek is saying, fascinating presentation. I have a very limited legal background, given that I'm a PhD biochemistry candidate and given that I'm working public health. But I do think it's an important conversation and discussion that we don't have enough data and work on. Colonialism is entrenched in our local healthcare system, given that we still utilize the universal healthcare system and the government-centered approach. It would be vital for these conversations to be had here and to include all these varying thoughts. Traditional medicines are more common in our culture as per the groups that reside here in our history, and these are being more studied within local health research. For this research, the traditional methods must be properly documented, as these are usually passed down orally, and I think this would be a good start. So thank you for that, Vivek. Very good tying back to the use of traditional medicines locally, and you're right. So we do tend to lose this knowledge over time, because if it's passed down orally, if it's not always passed down, because sometimes we have this conception of Western things being better, which is another conversation by itself. But documentation can actually be very important, even though the tradition might be oral. So a lot to think on. Thank you so much for this presentation today, Kayum. I think we all learned a lot. This has been recorded, so if anybody wants to review it, will be on our faculty's YouTube fairly soon. So thank you so much for your time, Kayum, and best of luck as you continue this very important research.
Thank you so much. Thanks for the opportunity, Emma, and wonderful to engage with all of you. Look forward to learning from you, learning alongside you, and thank you again for inviting me. Really appreciate that.
Thank you, and everyone have a great and safe weekend.
Bye-bye.